helps teach the Vancouver Police Department. And so she's like a really great instructor. She's thought very deeply about how to create very productive training environments. And she's also written a book, which, you know, I'll be sure to plug many times throughout this this conversation. But she's here to talk to us today about how to be a better training partner. And she's thought very deeply about this, so I'm excited to hear what she has to say. So just in the background, just so you know, Marlene and I will be unmuted. I'm going to ask everyone else to please mute your mics. There will be opportunities throughout to ask questions, and you can raise your hand using the button underneath the participants list. And with that, Kaja, take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the great intro, Charles. So I tend to keep things pretty informal as far as lectures go, so there should be a lot of opportunities for people to engage with what I'm talking about and ask questions. So when I decided to tackle this idea of being a better training partner, the way that I framed things today is we're going to start by talking a little bit about kind of the big picture, about how I think of motor learning in his martial arts, what kinds of things people need to be able to do in order to learn the skills that we teach. And then from there, we're going to focus in on how you can facilitate that kind of learning as a partner, both for the person you're working with and for yourself. So we're going to start really big and just kind of narrow things down further and further. And I've roughly broken it up into chunks so we can kind of build in pauses for questions and conversation. Does that sound like it'll work, Charles?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, awesome. So there's a couple kind of big concepts that I wanted to start off with, just so we're all on the same page in terms of how we think about learning to fight or learning to sword fight. And the first is the idea of closed versus open motor skills. So a closed skill is one that happens in an environment that is consistent and predictable. A really good example of that might be like throwing darts at a dartboard. You know, the dartboard isn't moving while you're trying to aim at it. Generally speaking, people are staying out of your space. They're not trying to interrupt you. The surface you're standing on is consistent throughout. Nothing really changes except for the thing that you are doing with your own body. A slightly more dynamic example of that might be something like gymnastics skill. Gymnasts do really complex, funky stuff that challenges their bodies in all kinds of physical ways, but they do it in an environment that's super controlled and super consistent. The balance beam stays where it is for the entirety of a routine. There are rules about what kinds of surfaces you're going to train on, you know, the dimensions of the trampoline you're jumping on or the floor you're tumbling across. So that a skill performed in training versus competition is going to be basically in the same environment or as similar of an environment as humanly possible. Mm-hmm. Those are closed skills. Open skills are kind of the opposite in that they're performed in an environment that is itself variable and changing and affecting the skill that has to be performed. And martial arts is kind of the perfect example of that. We, generally speaking, don't fight alone. And the opponent that we're dealing with is a very active participant in everything they do. If they are a physical target, that target is moving. They're also most likely trying to create obstacles to what we're doing or otherwise change the circumstances under which we're fighting. So if I say throw a lunge with my rapier, you know, on the training floor by myself, just aiming at a target, that's not really the same lunge as I throw against a partner who is in the process of parrying me or is changing position or is themselves attacking me, right? The lunge is to have to retarget to where they physically are. It might have to go slower or faster than it did when I practiced on the training floor. And it has to be responsive to the circumstances under which it's happening. So that is the kind of skill that we're talking about. And what that means from a training perspective is that there's two really big components that we have to develop in every skill we learn. One is the physical side. You know, in my lunge, can I hold my sword in a way that is efficient and mechanically useful? Can I move forward at the right speed? Can I do all the physical stuff that makes a lunge happen? But there's also a huge cognitive component, which involves making decisions on the fly and responding to my environment as it changes around me. So it's that same lunge is going to have to adapt to whatever my opponent's doing as they're doing it. And that means that I have to be able to think and make decisions and change the action that I'm performing in really, really, really small windows of time. And that's one of the things that makes martial arts amazing and interesting. And it's also one of the things that makes it really hard. And that can make it particularly challenging to teach. And specifically, where it creates challenges for us and why having training partners and working with other people is so important is that we have to practice with that open context, with that changing environment. You can stand in your cell and you can throw 10,000 perfect lunges in the air or at a static target on the wall. And that will give you really beautiful body mechanics, and it might help you be really efficient and really fast and all of that good stuff. But it's not actually training the cognitive component of the action at all. And if you were to just do 10,000 static lunges and then get into a sparring match or a serious fight, you'd probably get hosed pretty fast because you hadn't trained at all for responding to what your partner is giving you. So when we train, we have to balance that physical and that cognitive element. And for that, partner work is pretty much essential. Does that make sense as a general kind of conceptual framework?
Yeah. I mean, it's super ironic we're talking about partner work.
I know. It's
all separated. Oh, it hurts.
It's a little brutal. It's, you know, we can think about this stuff so that we're really, really excited to do it once we can actually be in the same space again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll be excellent to each other once we return to training.
It's a perfect setup for everyone to kind of do that introspection too as you're going through your lecture. So we will all have time to think about how we partner and how we want to be partnered, and then build on that when we all come back.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So thinking about that kind of skill building that we need to do, I kind of think of 3 different kinds of drills or exercises that we might perform in class. This is my 3-step drill building model that I use when I build lesson plans and when I teach. And I think it also works pretty well as kind of broad buckets to dump the exercises that we're doing into. So what I'm going to do is kind of describe these kinds of drills, and then we can talk about what a partner's job actually is in each of these situations, because it varies depending on the goal of the exercise. So step 1 or level 1 of learning a skill is building a basic motor pattern. It's figuring out how to move your body in the way that does the thing. So this is the very, very basic part. This is, how do I throw a cut so that it actually goes through where my target wants to go, and how do I coordinate my feet and my hands when I'm doing it? Same thing for a lunge, or if I'm doing boxing, you know, it's how do I throw a punch? Where does my hand go? What is my target? How do my hips and my shoulders rotate together? And from a motor science perspective, what we're basically doing at this stage is we're building what's called a motor pattern. So a set of actions that our body does that all come together to do a thing. Because when I throw a punch, I'm not going to go, okay, I have to engage the muscles of my arm in order to extend it, and then I have to adjust downwards a little bit with these muscles and a little bit with this shoulder, and then I have to rotate my shoulders, and then my feet have to go. There's 20 or 30 little muscular adjustments that happen when I do this, but I can't consciously work through all of them. So instead, I build a loose framework for it, and I tell my brain, throw a punch, and then I throw the punch. And it does all of those things that I've programmed. Mm-hmm. So our first stage is just building that program and getting it to the point that when I tell my body to throw a punch, it throws something that loosely approximates a punch. And that's where things like solo practice are really useful. That's where we do a lot of rote drilling, a lot of rote repetition. And that's where our job within a partnership is usually just to be a really consistent, simple stimulus for a person to respond to. I'm going to actually pause for half a second and just introduce the basic terminology here that I use in my book, and is similar to what gets used in a lot of martial arts, which is you kind of give different names to like the person doing the exercise and the person that they're doing it to, mm-hmm. if that makes sense. You know, in traditional Japanese mm-hmm. martial arts, we have things like uke and tori. When I talk about this, I talk about the person who is trying to learn the thing or trying to accomplish the thing as the player. They're playing a game, they're trying to solve a problem, something like that. And the person who is helping them do that is the feeder. So in that basic rote learning stage where we're just trying to build a motor program, the feeder is maybe just there to be a target. Maybe they're there to provide a really basic stimulus, like here is my attack that you're going to parry. And they're really just there to help the player build that basic program. Stage 2 is where things start to get more interesting. We take that basic program and we put it into context. And now the skill that we're starting to build on top of that basic motor programming is something that sometimes gets referred to as parameterization. I'm probably saying it right. So that's when you take your basic motor program and you adjust it to suit a slightly different circumstance. So you take your real basic punch that you now got down to a science and you figure out, okay, how do I throw this punch but aim slightly to this side or slightly to that side or down, or how do I do it faster or slower? Or how do I do it with my other hand? Because once I've learned the motor program, you can kind of swap it between limbs. So parameterization is the process of taking a basic motor program and adapting it to the specific set of circumstances that it's currently being thrown on. So in terms of drills, where this shows up is things like if we're doing a basic striking drill, my partner, rather than just having a focus pad here that I'm just throwing repeated punches to, is maybe going to start moving it around and giving me targets in different places, maybe varying distance that I'm aiming to, that kind of thing. If they are throwing cuts that I need to parry, maybe they're going to start throwing those cuts from slightly different angles, or having them come in at different speeds. So we're still in basic skill building mode, but we've started to combine physical and cognitive components in that my brain has to recognize, oh, stuff has changed and I need to do this specific version of the skill rather than that one that I was practicing that was kind of a generic version. Mm-hmm. And there, the feeder's job is to be context for the skill. They're probably not being much of like an obstacle or a challenge or what have you. They're just creating enough variation that the player has to adapt to what's happening. Stage 3, which is where I like to spend the largest amount of time, is problem solving. So you're now taking the skill which you figured out the basic movements for, which you've put into some kind of context, you've learned how to parameterize. And then what you're doing is you're using it to solve a problem or to achieve a goal. Most of the plays that we see in HEMA manuals are a really good example of this. They take a skill and they use it to do something, whether that's to create an opening, to strike somebody, to defend against a particular attack, to create space so that you can enter a grapple, all of those things. What those are demonstrating is application of skills in the problem-solving context. And that's really where the cognitive aspect of open skills is being developed the most strongly. Yeah, you're practicing the physical skill, you're getting better at doing it mechanically. Mostly what you're doing there is figuring out how to actually make it do the stuff you need to do to win the fight, or to survive the next half a second. And there, the feeder is suddenly basically constructing the entire problem that the player is responding to. They might be an obstacle that the player needs to get past in order to achieve their goal. They might be a threat that the player needs to defend against, but they are responsible for posing the question that the player needs to answer or handing them the problem that they need to solve. So kind of writ large, those are, as a feeder, those are our responsibilities. We're here to help them learn the thing. We're here to help them learn to adapt the thing, or we're here to make them use the thing to deal with us in some capacity. And I really feel like in order to be, you know, a good partner or somebody who can really help the player learn, it's really useful to make sure that you know exactly what your job or what your role is within a drill. And I think especially this can happen in HEMA a little bit, in that sometimes what happens is we do things like we talk about the mechanical skill building or kind of the basic movement development, but we put it within the context of a play already. And sometimes the feeder isn't sure if what they're supposed to be doing is just letting their partner learn how to do a movement, or whether they're supposed to be challenging them with it in some way, whether they're supposed to be trying to win the engagement or what have you. So I think starting with clarity about how drills work, what kinds of things they're trying to achieve, and what your job is within them is kind of our first step. I wanted to get into kind of details of how feeder is supposed to do that job, but do we have any questions or any discussion points here?
Questions?
How in depth do you go as the instructor when you're explaining these drills? Do you say, you know, feeder, this is your goal, this is your job, this is the exact stimulus I want you to try to present? Player, this is how, like, this is the thing you're trying to do it?
If we are, especially once we're at sort of the third stage of drills, the problem solving thing, I try to provide as little concrete framing as possible, because then people start trying to do what they think you want them to do rather than actually solve the problem. So what I will usually do is tell the player, for example, you're going to try to land a hit to your partner's left shoulder and then get out to safety. And feeder, while they're doing that, you can try to counter them as they come in or parry their first attack. So that kind of thing. You give the feeder parameters that they're going to operate within. This is the general stuff you can do and the stuff that you can't do. And player, go do the thing. Obviously, that can vary depending on the level of experience in the group. If I'm dealing with a whole bunch of beginners, one of the things that I'm definitely going to do is spend some time explaining how we do drills, what the point is, how they work. And I do think that one of the things that we can do as instructors is to be a little bit more explicit about what we want from people in drills. Not necessarily you provide X stimulus at Y time, but hey guys, in general, this is what this exercise is trying to accomplish. So your job is to help your partner figure that out, or something to that effect, even as a check-in or a reminder with very experienced groups. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And then I guess, do you let them go off on little like tangents as they figure things out? Like it's bound to happen, right? Where they find another counter that works better, or they find a movement that they really like that might not be the thing or the parameter within which they were supposed to be focusing?
So
I know you talk about it a little bit in your book, but I'm very curious.
This is a fun tangent because I think we start to get into teaching style differences.
Okay.
In that it really depends on what you're trying to get them to do. Are you trying to get them, you know, if I just want them to be able to solve a particular problem, I'm not going to be super picky about how they get there. And if they find a really exciting or really useful counter that I can see works perfectly fine, I'm not going to be like, maybe not that one. If I wanted them to recreate a particular answer to a problem, because, for example, we were working on a specific play from a text that I wanted to get, I try really hard not to tell students that their answer is wrong or that it's not what we're looking for. And I think that ability to go off on tangents is really fruitful because it means that people are thinking critically what they're doing and are actually actively really engaging in that problem solving thing. What I would do if somebody has, you know, if somebody is trying to solve a problem and they come up with a kind of wacky response and I'm like, whoa, that is not what we were working on right here. First, I'll watch them for a minute. I'll let them try it a couple times and then see if they abandon it themselves and go back to the other thing, because sometimes people do. And if that's just the rabbit hole that they've decided to go down, then what I will do is grab the feeder and I will give them some cues as to how to adapt what they're doing to kind of change the problem that the player is trying to answer and nudge them towards a different solution. So change the question in order to get a better answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. No, we're kind of on the same page there, but I like the idea of focusing on the feeder more so than the player. I think
pretty much always, and I'll.
Yeah. I think that's going to be a new thing I'm trying out. What's up, guys?
It's hard. That actually leads me really nicely into my next point. Shall I carry on? Or do we have another question?
So hang on, let me double check because John was messaging me to see if there was a raise hand question. John, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, if I can just go, can you hear me?
Yeah, yep.
So my thing I wrestle with is aggression versus non-aggression. It's a lot easier for me to put an aggressive fighter in check and be like, hey, tamp it back. But what I have a hard time doing is drawing non-aggressive students into a more aggressive, combative mindset. Do you have any thoughts on that in the context, you know, feeding and drawing that person out?
I do. Can I actually put a little bit of a pin in that because I think it's something that I'm going to get to in a few minutes?
Okay, I'm usually ahead of the curve. Sorry.
No.
I'll stand by.
No worries. I'm really good at going off on tangents, and I want to make sure I don't skip over other material that I wanted to get at. But I will absolutely 100% address that.
Cool.
Yeah. The bit that I wanted to get into leading off of kind of the previous discussion about how we coach the feeder rather than the player comes into one of the really important aspects of the feeder's job, and one of the hardest things often for us to handle both as coaches and as feeders, especially if we are the more experienced person in an interaction. And that's the difference between extrinsic feedback and intrinsic feedback. So extrinsic feedback is what something outside of yourself or someone outside of yourself tells you. It's your partner going, oh, that was good, or you missed. Or it's your instructor going, okay, but try that again with your feet a little bit closer together, or move your sword to the right. Or it's seeing yourself in a mirror or seeing yourself in a video replay or something like that. So it's feedback that is given to you from outside your own physical and cognitive inputs. And it's what we often think of when we say feedback in coaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
Intrinsic feedback is what your own senses tell you about what's happening. So it's things like when you throw a cut and something feels kind of wobbly and wonky about it, or when you throw a punch and the sound it makes is either like really kind of good and satisfying or kind of a bleh. It's in martial arts, it's often literally the feeling of getting hit because you didn't defend against something appropriately, or you mistimed your action or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And intrinsic feedback is far more valuable to cultivate than extrinsic feedback.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of studies that have been done on this, on the value of different kinds. Extrinsic feedback in general tends to shortcut people's internal learning process, because a big part of learning a motor skill is powering up the motor program, figuring out what it's supposed to do, doing the thing, and then figuring out if it worked. And you have to be able to find that out on your own. And if you've tried something 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times, every single time you do that, you're getting data on what it did. And if somebody is standing over your shoulder and correcting you every single time you do it, it interrupts that process of gathering your own information and gathering your own data. Mm. And if we think about the context that people actually have to use martial arts skills in, this makes perfect sense in terms of value, in that when somebody is out sparring, let's look at a tournament context, because that's something a lot of us are familiar with. You've got, let's say, 2 rounds of fighting. That's fairly common with pauses, or maybe 5 or 6 exchanges with a pause at the end where you can go and talk to your corner. You've got at most those 5 or 6 opportunities to get extrinsic feedback, to have your corner tell you a thing about your fighting. But every single action that happens within the fight itself gives you intrinsic feedback that you have to respond to and understand and be able to interpret. You know, if we're in a non-competitive context, if somebody is in a real fight or in a historical duel or a battle or whatever, they may only have intrinsic feedback to rely on. There may not be a person standing over their shoulder going, oh, that was good, but pick up your foot a little bit higher. All they can rely on is what their body is telling them about the situation that they're in, which means that that's the biggest thing that we need to train. And what that in turn means is that when we're drilling in partnered work, our job as feeder is to maximize the quality of the intrinsic feedback that the player is getting and make sure they get as much of it as humanly possible. So a big part of how that works in terms of extrinsic feedback is to mostly knock it off as the feeder, to not coach, to not correct, to not explain things to the other person. Because every time that happens, that robs them of the opportunity to figure it out for themselves. Yeah. And we know for sure that at some point, they're going to have to figure it out for themselves, because that's how fighting works. So instead, in terms of feedback, what you can focus on is playing with the quality of the feedback that they're getting. So, for example, making sure that we are throwing a very, very good, clean attack that they have to parry, so that when they fail to parry it, it hits them in the target that it would actually hit. And therefore, the quality of the intrinsic feedback they're getting is accurate. It reflects pretty much what would happen in real life. And that's where the thing I was talking about earlier comes in, where if we want to change the player's behavior, if we want them to try a different solution or change how they're moving, in my opinion, the best way of doing that is to change the intrinsic feedback they're getting, to make them realize, oh, well, this was working before because something was different, but now, you know, now that the cut that is being thrown at me has been slightly adjusted, I keep getting bonked in the face. So maybe that wasn't as cool of a solution as I thought it was. And that's going to be a lot more effective for their own learning process than standing there and going, well, actually, that doesn't work so well, so maybe you should try something different. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat text popping up.
Oh, no.
Not do that.
Oh, no. Yeah. Our last speaker had slides, and so they couldn't see it, so we were reading off the chat questions.
Yeah, it's totally fine. I just need to not.
Oh, it's fine. Well, I've got a question actually that.
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, it sounds like, well, not really a question, more of a comment that, you know, by focusing on getting your partner to develop their own tools or self-diagnose, not only are you improving, you know, whatever they learn in the time they spend with you, but when they go home and do their own solo practice, the fact that they've been trained, like, hey, maybe you should look at your feet, or you know, how do you, where do you think your balance is, or you know, giving them kind of discrete homework problems that revolve around intrinsic feedback. So it seems like that is a one way to be a good partner, rather than say, like, you need to keep your head in position XYZ. Instead, it should be, hey, you know, when you go home, focus on your head position. That seems like a way to develop a long-term skill for a martial artist.
Absolutely. And actually, the language that you're using is a really good way for feeders to potentially give verbal feedback that's still really useful, which is, rather than telling them, for example, stop tilting your head or change your head, just cueing somebody to what kind of intrinsic feedback they should be paying attention to is super, super valuable. Because learning to listen to what your body is telling you, learning to process intrinsic feedback is a skill, right? It's not something that people necessarily know how to do. So a really useful thing that a feeder or a coach can do is after they've seen somebody doing something weird for a bit, be like, hey, do you know what your head is doing when you lunge? And not like, don't feed them an answer, but just for the next couple of reps, have them pay attention to that one part of their body and what it's doing.
Yeah.
And then that opens up an opportunity for them to make their own adjustments. And a lot of times people will be like, oh, what the hell? I didn't even realize I was doing that. Yeah. And once they've started to cue into that, they'll pay attention to it later. You know, it's a change that I made in my coaching of beginners about a year or so ago. I used to yell at everybody to move their feet. Move your feet, move your feet, move your goddamn feet. And I think that's something that a lot of instructors can relate to, because a lot of times people just kind of lose track of what the hell their feet are doing. And now what I tell people instead is to pay attention to their feet, to notice what their feet are doing, or to go, hey, how did you step when you did that? Yeah. And not tell them if it was right or wrong, but just get them actually thinking about it. Yeah. So that's a really big thing that we can do as feeders, is play around with, okay, how can I get this person paying attention to the correct intrinsic feedback, or the intrinsic feedback that they need right now? And also, if we're not talking, how do I give them the intrinsic feedback that they need to fix that thing I see? If you're in kind of coaching mode. And that can be super, super interesting and engaging for the feeder, and is a good way of kind of building your own tactical sense of how you relate to another human in the fight, and how you get people to do what you want, which is a fundamental component of setting up a lot of actions. It's a fundamental element of deception, all of those kinds of things. If I can make my partner respond in the way that I would like them to, then that's such a fundamental fighting skill. And it's one of the ways that feeders can kind of sneak their own learning into that part of a training exercise. The other big piece that I want to address before we can kind of take more questions, is kind of implicit in some of the discussion that we've been having, when people go on tangents, when people aren't doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, when people are getting hit, which is that a fundamental part of learning how to problem solve and learning to adapt in a complex open skill environment is failure, is screwing up, is making mistakes, is getting hit, is trying the wrong solution to the problem and doing completely the wrong thing. And so a really big part of the feeder's job, in some ways the most important part, is giving the player opportunities to fail and making it safe for them to do so. And I talk a ton about that in my book. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in terms of how it relates specifically to like the individual partnership question, there's basically 3 flavors of safety that we have to provide to our partners so that they can actually do the problem solving and fail and learn. The first one is physical. And the easiest way to address that as a training partner is calibration, is making sure that, because like we said, a chunk of the intrinsic feedback that we get as fighters is pain from getting hit or the feeling of getting hit, making sure that we're hitting them at an appropriate level of force. The point of hitting somebody in a drill when we're still in learning time rather than playing or pressure testing time is to give them the feedback they need to go, that didn't work, I need to try something different. Which means that we should really only be hitting people hard enough that they're definitely aware of what happened, but not hard enough that they're scared. And I know that sometimes we can kind of think, well, you know, if they really don't want to get hit, that's a great motivation for them to do it right. And I think that's kind of bullshit. In that if they're learning, if they're building their basic understanding of a skill, they need to be able to get things wrong because they don't know what right is yet. They don't know how to feel that, oh yes, I got it right, without the context of first having gotten it wrong, right? If we screw this up, it's the Goldilocks thing. It's this is too big, this is too small, this is just right. Without the pieces of data that tell you what didn't work, you don't really know what's right. Which means getting hit should not be a punishment. It should be a data point. So that's our kind of physical safety component.
Cool.
Mental or emotional safety is the second one, and that's kind of tied up in calibration as well. You don't want to trigger somebody, you don't want to cause them emotional trauma, you don't want to cause them unreasonable distress when they fail. Again, part of that is just not being an asshole, not going too hard. Part of it might be being aware of whether people have specific triggers about certain kinds of actions, that kind of thing. Those are sort of club safety conversations that can happen, but mostly just, you know, being aware. And the last one that I think can sometimes be glossed over and missed a little bit, but is actually super important, is that failure has to be a socially safe thing to do, which means that it should be clear to your partner, to the player, that you expect them to screw up and that them screwing up is a good thing. And that means, you know, don't laugh at them when they screw up. Don't roll your eyes when they get something wrong for the 8th time. Don't look visibly bored. And it might also be taking the opportunity to offer positive extrinsic feedback when they screw up in a way that you can see is leading them towards the good solution, right? If somebody aims for the right opening and throws the right cut, but their timing is a little off, that's where you go, oh yeah, that was almost it. Perfect. Do that again, but just play with your timing a little bit. Or, yeah, no, that was exactly right, just a little faster. Or what if you did that, but like a little lower? That was awesome. And we reinforce the fact that failure is a step on the process towards learning how to do it right. So those are some of the really big kind of coaching type skills or approaches that we can take as a feeder if we're in like teaching mode is, okay, how do I give this person the right feedback? How do I get them to be okay with failing? And how do I encourage them when they're failing in a right direction? And then how do I reinforce when they have found the solution? And that's really where extrinsic feedback does have its value. That's where going, yes, that was awesome, is kind of the best thing you can do. And the studies back me up on this. As far as the sports science on this is concerned, the best kind of extrinsic feedback, the most effective kind, is infrequent and positive. So you let people mess around, you let people screw up, and then when they're heading in the right direction or when they do something awesome, you go, fuck yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it for extrinsic feedback. And if you can combine that with playing around with figuring out how to get them to get the right intrinsic feedback, you're doing a great job at that kind of coaching element of being a partner. And in terms of, actually, the one thing I'll add in terms of failure, because this is a place where classroom environment can make a really big difference as well. This is somewhere where I will often give students an explicit goal in terms of, all right, feeders, when your partner's doing this drill, they should be able to do the things successfully, let's say 75% of the time.
Yeah, I remember this.
You know?
Yeah.
If they do 5 reps, 1 or 2 of them should fail. And that's really nice for kind of training feeders, in that it gives them something really concrete to aim for and something to focus on in the drill. Is you can go, okay, cool. So I'm going to count, and they did this 5 times and they nailed it every time. All right, I should probably make this harder for them. Or, you know, okay, this is the appropriate level of difficulty and feedback that I'm giving them, because they're screwing up every 1 or 2 out of 5 times, and otherwise they're doing great. As far as like any data we have on failure rates is concerned, there's not a ton, but there were a couple of studies done that showed that, like, if you have 100% success in an exercise, if you get it right every single time, retention no longer improves. You no longer get better at the skill.
Yeah.
With a lower success rate, your retention goes up, and that relationship is pretty tight right up until about 50% failure. So as long as you're getting it right half the time, you're still going to be improving. The problem is that morale tends to tank around the 70% success mark, which is why I tend to think of like somewhere between 70 and 80% as like the goal that I want to hit. It means that we have enough failure in there that I know for sure that people are challenging themselves, that they're learning. But I don't get a bunch of demoralized students who have basically been, you know, running smack into a wall for 20 minutes, because that's real shitty and nobody would come back.
Yeah.
So those are kind of global coaching approaches that I would take as a feeder if I was trying to kind of help the player improve. And then after this, I'm going to break things down into a bit more specific skills, but this seems like an okay place to take some questions.
So one of the questions that was up here from earlier, I'm afraid I don't know who asked it, but they were asking, they were essentially pointing out the assumption that the feeder is more experienced than the player. Right. Yeah, and I guess, you know, if we flip it around, say I'm someone new and I'm paired with someone who, like, I believe or I know is more experienced than me, how do I be a good feeder when, you know, maybe I can't even achieve 80%, right? I can only get down to, you know, 90%, or I'm not able to give that good extrinsic feedback, whatever it is, and I'm not even sure what intrinsic feedback I'm creating in my partner.
Right. At that point, you're really going to focus on developing those skills for yourself. On, okay, this is my opportunity to practice. So if I decide that I want to focus on giving them good intrinsic feedback, what I can start with is just by doing the best damn job I can on every action I take. It's, you know, if I have to throw a cut for them to parry, then I'm going to make sure that it is a good cut and that it aims true for the target every single time. So that I know that when I hit them, it's a realistic representation of me hitting them. And often for a lot of beginners, or for a lot of less experienced students, that's a really big thing, is just feeding consistently and honestly and with intention behind it. It's probably the easiest way to give good intrinsic feedback. And it's also a skill that serves you so well in the future, and it takes a while to develop. So that's a really good thing to focus on, is just, am I doing my very best in terms of performing these actions honestly? And what I mean by honestly is actually trying to hit my partner, or, you know, knock their sword out of the way, or do whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing, as a distinct thing from trying to win the drill. So you're not trying to beat them, you're not trying to win the exchange, but you are trying to give them the thing that you were tasked with doing as best as humanly possible. And if you focus on doing that really consistently and well, it'll make a huge difference, even if there is a substantial experience imbalance. And it'll also allow you to start kind of seeing what kind of intrinsic feedback the other person gets when you do your best. So that's where I'd start.
Got it. So I've got one question of my own, well, kind of a feeder question, but so what about people on the side? People standing around who observe the drill. Is there any place for them, or is there not? What tertiary observers, that type of thing?
So that can be really valuable in a couple of circumstances. The first is if the tertiary observer is somebody who cannot physically participate in the drill themselves. Watching can be really, really valuable for learning. And there's great value to that person in having them observe drills. In terms of them providing coaching or them providing feedback to the participants, I tend to stick to my golden rule of shut up if at all possible. The challenge that I set myself a few years back, and that served me really well, is if you're watching a drill and you see somebody make a mistake and you want to tell them how to fix it, or draw their attention to it, let them make a total of 5 attempts. And if after those 5 attempts they still haven't fixed the thing, then you get to intervene. But like, well over half the time, people will self-correct. They will pay attention to the intrinsic feedback that they're getting, and they'll fix it. In which case, if you see something like that, then as an external observer, that's a really good opportunity to be like, yeah, good job. You know, give that positive extrinsic feedback of, fuck yeah, you did the thing. Reinforce the learning that just happened. If you do decide, if that outside observer is deciding to intervene, then that again becomes a really good opportunity to come up to the feeder and go, hey, try doing this instead and see if it changes their response. And practice tweaking it from that end. Also, obviously, external monitoring can be very useful if there's potential for safety issues. You know, those people can be there to step in if something really goes sideways and there's a danger. The last place where they can be very useful, depending on what specifically you're trying to train for, is that being watched tends to stress people out a little bit. So if you want to introduce a little bit more challenge to a drill, if you want to add a little bit of psychological stress for whatever, you know, valid pedagogical reason, then having a bunch of people standing there and just watching it is a real safe way to do that.
I do it the other way. Oh my God. Okay. So when I'm looking at someone and I'm just evaluating them, I usually try to sneak up so I'm not seen, just so that I can observe them without that additional stress. But you're saying let's reverse it and stress the shit out of them.
Well, I'm saying if you're,
I mean,
if one of your learning goals,
as a tool. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, not categorically, but like
yeah,
as
but like,
a stress tool. That's great.
exactly. Yeah, if you
Oh.
want to stress somebody, watching them is so easy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I'll be quiet now. I'll open it up to other questions or.
So before we move on, Kelly did have a question. She asked,
okay.
what about analysis paralysis when someone is overthinking their actions too much? So that like intrinsic overload, I guess.
Yep. The solution to that is keep moving. Analysis paralysis tends to freeze people. It gets them kind of caught in a loop where they're not actually acting. They're just trying to think about what's happening. And action will pull them out of that. Like it's a stress response, and it's one that can be fairly easily resolved by movement. Which means if you're the feeder and the player you're working with, you can see gets stuck, gets frozen, or is trying to talk their way through things or what have you, then you can either tell them, hey, just try it again, just get a couple of reps in. Don't worry about whether you're doing it right or not. Just start moving and let's see what happens. Or if you've got the skills to do it, you can start changing what you're doing or just make them move. If they're standing there and talking, be like, all right, let's do this again, and throw the cut at them or whatever the stimulus is. The trick is to get them using their bodies and not worrying about whether they're getting it right. So the other place where that might sometimes come in is if somebody is really worried that they're getting the wrong answer. And I've had this sometimes with students who came out of shitty training environments where they were supposed to, no, just figure it out. But if they didn't get the exact answer that the instructor expected them to get, they'd get yelled at or they'd get punished for it. So if somebody doesn't feel like it's safe for them to fail because they've had bad experiences in the past, then reminding them of the fact that it's okay if they screw up and it is in fact encouraged for them to do so can be enough to break them out of that habit. How's that?
I think that's perfect. I've started messing with that, especially with newer students, because a lot of what we're working on isn't it's not inherent. It's not the same thing as walking. Like we're trying to make one side of our body move at the same time and leave the other part behind kind of stuff. So it's always you see that information overload or their faces start doing that weird, I can't take on any more information thing. And you're just all right, calm down, everybody stop. And we're literally going to shake it out. Just noodle everything, shake out the stimulus, and then we'll try again. See what's actually sticking and what's not.
I feel like that's a really good cue as well if you're seeing it when you're doing verbal instruction, that you're probably talking too much, which we all do, is when you see the eyes go oh crap, I need to get these people moving. They're too stuck in their brains and I need to get them back into their bodies. So yeah, the shake thing is out thing is really good. Or also sometimes if I see people kind of stop their drill and start talking about stuff, which happens, I will literally just shout across the room, less talking, more stabbing, and just tell them to move. And that works as well because we've kind of built a classroom environment where people know that it's okay if they fuck up. So when I yell at them to start moving, there's no implicit and you must get it right. So that's something that takes a little bit of maybe working on. But yeah, a lot of the time, move your damn body is the easiest way to break somebody out of that. Sorry, I'm really warm and I'm just taking off my socks.
Looks like Joe has a question.
Yeah, so I was just curious. I feel like we've been dancing around this a little bit. In terms of intrinsic feedback, how do you deal with noise, noisy inputs and stuff? Prime example here would be a tournament situation where, and you mentioned earlier, over a long enough time scale, people are going to figure something out, but that optimization is going to be specific to whatever the context is, right? So especially if we're looking at, historical study, do you have any specific approaches to dealing with stuff that that seemed like a good thing and it seemed to work, and that's great, but that maybe just isn't really what we're going for here.
Right. Okay. I see what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the ways that I found really useful for that is refocusing on context and on the goal, because a lot of times, like when somebody, you know, figures out a solution that isn't the solution we were looking for, the reason that there's a mismatch is because that solution isn't doing quite the same thing. Maybe it's, you know, if we're trying to get them to perform a strike that'll set them up for a specific follow-up action, you can draw their attention to whether that's actually providing an adequate setup. Or we can kind of focus them in on the very specific historical context that we're working in. And this is something that I know Charles plays around with a lot, that idea of like, well, okay, sure, you could chop his head off with your messer, but socially that was unacceptable and you probably would have gotten thrown in jail and or gotten the shit kicked out of you. So what is a solution that is appropriate to the specific context that this skill was developed for? You know, or a friend was recently talking about examples in like Fiore's swordplay, where a lot of the stuff that you did unarmored was the same material as you would do armored. So there's certain actions you don't take because if you were wearing armor, you would overbalance in them. Mm-hmm. Bringing in those kinds of contextual cues for students and getting them to kind of think about them and being like, yeah, all right, that worked, but does it still work if we consider everything that applies to this situation? And if we apply the correct context and the situation is built the same way that the thing we were trying to achieve was, and their solution still works, at that point I kind of start to question if it was actually wrong or not. But those are pretty, like, that's a bit of an edge case.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And actually, I think this is a good time to come back to that question of aggression and drawing out students who are not aggressive enough, especially in a drilling context. Mm-hmm. And one of the most, because for people that aren't familiar with my school, we have a very large population of female students, lots of folks coming in as adults who don't have a background in martial arts, don't have a background in combat stuff, and are generally not used to hitting people. So student who is not aggressive enough is one of kind of the most common scenarios that I deal with. And it's worth understanding kind of the root of non-aggression, the reason that people are scared of doing that kind of thing. And it's usually because they believe that hitting somebody is going to cause them harm, that it's going to do them damage, either physical or emotional, or that they are going to get punished for hitting somebody because that's what happened to them in the past. They were taught that you do not hit. So the easiest way that I have found to get students to be more aggressive, especially in a partnered training environment, is to really, 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 really explicitly give them permission to do it. And I've had straight up conversations about consent with people. I've been like, look, your partner there, she signed a waiver. She came in here with the intention of learning how to box or how to do sword fighting. And the only way that she can learn that is if we hit her. And I'll explain how intrinsic feedback works, and that you have to get hit in order to learn, and that you have to understand why what you were doing didn't work. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it flips it around, and that same kind of sense of a duty of care that was holding people back before, that idea that when you're training with a partner, part of your job is to keep them safe and to take care of them. So you don't want to hit them because then they would get hurt. that gets flipped around on you and becomes a positive pressure instead, where it's, well, no, if you want to help them, if you want them to grow, if you want them to learn, if you want them to be safe in the future, then you got to hit them. And being aggressive, hitting somebody, committing to attacks, then becomes an act of service to your partner and becomes something that you do so that they can be safe from harm in the future, because they've learned how to defend against an earnest attack. And I'll sometimes, especially if I've got a class of beginners, or if I see a couple of people in the room are struggling with the same thing, I'll do a little bit of a demo, and I'll do a partnered exercise with somebody, and I'll have them, for example, throw a strike at my head, but have it miss and go over, which is a thing that people often do when they're not being aggressive, right? They're like, oh, no, I won't actually hit you. I'm just gonna, meh. I will wave my sword in your general direction, but it's not doing anything.
Yeah.
And when somebody does them, and I'll parry it, and I'll be like, look, I did a great job. The parry worked. If we keep doing this and they never hit me, what I learn is that that is a good parry, and it was accurate. And then I'll have them actually throw an earnest attack, and I'll fuck up the parry, because all of a sudden the distance has changed, and the timing of the blow has changed, and all of the characteristics that I was adapting to are different. And I'll show my students that by being nice in the drill, by not trying to hurt me, they actually put me in more danger, because the first time somebody does throw a real hit, I'm pretty much guaranteed to get attacked. That's particularly useful in a self-defense context, but it does show up in drills as well. So I make earnest attacks and kind of that element of what we sometimes call aggression into a baseline feeder skill and a baseline responsibility you have to the people that you're training with. And that gives people permission to actually do it. And it also provides a ton of positive reinforcement without it being a weird, like, rah, rah, you got to prove your tough masculinity thing.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people that doesn't work for. They go, oh, but that's not me. I can never be that person. That's not who I am inside. So obviously it's not accessible to me. But no, it has nothing to do with your identity. It has nothing to do with who you are. It has nothing to do with any intrinsic part of your nature. It's about you doing your goddamn job in the drill.
Yeah. I love that. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
I think that was John's question.
Yeah. If I could, while you're sipping water there, I like the part you said, making sure they understand it's their responsibility. You know, that's a really important part, that it's the responsibility to help each other. And yeah, I've tried that a couple of times, and some people, it seems to work. Other folks still just, they've got this hang up about hurting people, which I like that, because I don't want to get hurt. But yeah, no, I like the responsibility concept. That helps.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. If they're really stuck on just, I don't want to hurt people, sometimes what can really help is putting them with somebody that you know can handle a fairly high level of intensity, and just having them hit them a couple times and realize that they're not doing any damage. There's a drill I use sometimes. It's the second drill, I think, in the back of my book. I'm going to be sharing a video of it on my Patreon in a little bit, but it basically involves smacking people across the face and into the head as a basic evasion drill. But what it's really about is it's about teaching people to hit each other. And one of the things that I love doing with that one is demonstrating it in front of the class, and having a real big dude and a real small woman doing it together, and having the woman be the one that gets hit. And having her be fine, because that really gets to that deep hang up that a lot of people have, both men and women, about, oh, we're not supposed to do harm, and going, look, this is a thing that happens in martial arts. Pain happens, discomfort happens, but we're also a lot tougher than we look. And if you're doing things properly, if you're honestly paying attention to how you've calibrated, and if you have a sense of how hard you really hit people, you're not going to break us. We're not that fragile. That being said, and again, that flows nicely into the next thing I had planned. Calibration, that idea of delivering an appropriate level of force, is a skill. It's something that needs to be actively developed. And I think it's one of the fundamental skills of both members of a partnership, which is that they should be able to hit each other only as hard as is necessary. And they should be able to understand that, that is how hard I hit that person. Like they should be able to process the internal feedback they get from their own, the intrinsic feedback, sorry, that they get from their own strikes and go, that was hard, that was soft, that was just right. And that's something that you can drill, that's something that you can practice as a group. And that's kind of the last piece of addressing the I don't want to hit people question, I think, is that sometimes you do get people, especially bigger, stronger people, who don't have a strong confidence in their own ability to calibrate, and are worried that they're going to hurt somebody even without trying because they don't really have a good sense of how hard they're hitting or how much of an impact they're having on another person. And for them, doing some focused work that's as simple as like, all right, well, hit that heavy bag. Did you see how much it moved? Okay, now hit it and make it move less. Or doing the same thing with a PEL, or doing the same thing with a focus pad, or doing the same thing with an appropriately armored partner. Just getting them to learn, this is how hard I hit. This is what it feels like when I hit somebody really hard. This is what it feels like when I hit somebody an amount that they tell me is appropriate. Building up their internal understanding of how well they can calibrate is going to make them feel like it's a lot easier to keep others safer. And that can also help deal with that reluctance. So that's kind of the last piece that I would add to that puzzle. Charles, you good if I continue?
Yeah, let's go.
Cool. So yeah, the last piece that I kind of had to this was, okay, so what are like fundamental skills that you should have as a partner? As a feeder, number one was calibration, which we just talked about. You should have the ability to hit somebody exactly as hard as you intend to hit them. And to be able to adjust how hard you're hitting or how much resistance you're providing based on what you feel in an interaction with your partner. And that is something that can be done as separate skill building if it's something that you don't feel comfortable in. Skill number two, and I've kind of hammered away at this already, is the ability to shut up. The ability to pull back from providing extrinsic feedback unless it's actually helpful. And I'm going to call that a skill because I know how hard it is. There's also a certain level of emotional literacy that you need to have. You need to be able to see some of the psychological impacts that your actions are having on your partner. So that if you see that they've frozen in fear, or that they're, suddenly shrinking away from what you're doing, or if they look really visibly upset, or if they've started amping up and it looks like they're starting to get adrenalized, you should be able to spot that and adjust your actions accordingly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be able to de-escalate somebody who's super adrenalized or in the middle of a trauma response, but it means going, oh, something has changed in my partner's emotional state. I should deal with that, even if dealing with it is going, whoa, stop, and then frantically waving your instructor over so that they can help. You have to be emotionally cued in to what's going on with the person that you're fighting. Luckily, this is a super useful skill to use offensively as well. Once you've figured out how to read, once you figured out how to read somebody's emotional state and how to manipulate it in a positive direction, it's really easy to flip that around in a non-cooperative, non-friendly, non-drilling context and use it to tilt the fight to your advantage, to screw with people's heads. It's an immensely valuable skill. The next one that's really important is what I call the art of the setup. So this is when we're trying to get somebody to kind of that right level of failure. We're trying to challenge them appropriately. In order to do that, often what we need to understand is what conditions they need in order to do the thing successfully, right? If they're trying to make a parry, then I need to understand the timing that need to make it within, the position that they need to have, and the distance that they need to be operating at in order to do it correctly. And those are all things that I'm gonna try to help them find so that they can succeed, or that I might mess with a little if I want them to have a slightly higher failure rate to challenge them. And if I'm building that understanding as I'm training with my partner, then once again, that's a really valuable tactical skill that's going to serve my fighting elsewhere. That's going to be, if I can look at what somebody's trying to accomplish and pull it apart and go, okay, well, these are the 3 conditions that they need for success, and I can take that one away from them. Done. Then you're developing really, really valuable fighting skills. The last one that we've been talking about a little bit is that art of good feeding, of making sure that you are giving them an honest attack that is doing what they think it should do. And what that really is, to, besides like a mechanical skill, is it's an element of nonverbal communication, right? It's going, I'm going to hit you, and showing them with your body that you're going to hit them and making them genuinely believe that you're going to hit them because you're going to hit them. Super, super valuable basic partner skill. And again, if we flip it around and bring it into a non-cooperative context, this is how deception works. This is how we set up feints. This is how we lie to people, is we make them believe what we're going to do next. We make them respond to a stimulus as if it's really going to fucking happen, and then we change it on them. So all of those basic skills, calibration, emotional literacy, setups, and communication and feeding, they're all of the things that you need in order to be able to be a good fighter. And they're also the essential soft skills. Sorry, let me unwind that sentence. They are all of the skills that you need to be a good feeder, a good partner. And they're also all things that will make you a better fighter, and are often sort of soft skills or cognitive skills that we don't really set aside time to practice separately. And so in that case, partner drills become a really good opportunity for whoever's on the feeder side to work on all of this useful tactical stuff that they might not get opportunities to do otherwise. I'm gonna wrap up by bringing it back to the player, because we've obviously been really focused on the feeder side of things because that tends to be what people find challenging. There are a couple of things that are also really valuable to being a good player, and I want to make sure that those get highlighted. First one, again, is calibration. It's force control. It's understanding how much force you're delivering. Because just because it's your turn to do the thing or to learn doesn't mean that you have the right to break your partner, right? You have to make sure that you're bringing appropriate force into the exercise. There's also an emotional literacy that you need to have. You need to be able to see what's going on with your partner, because it's entirely possible for a player to upset or freak out or mess with a feeder. But also you have to be aware of what's going on with yourself. And you have to have the ability to notice when something's gone weird. And to go, oh shit, I got adrenalized. Here, hang on, can we just step back a little bit? Or, man, I'm getting really frustrated and really upset and I don't know why, and I'm super pissed off right now. Being able to notice those things in yourself is going to make you a much better partner. It's going to potentially help you tamp down on situations that escalate out of control before they get to that point. And it's also going to help build your ability to process intrinsic feedback and to figure out what's going on in a fight, because you're paying attention to your own emotional state as well as the things that are happening to your body physically. And that's kind of an integral component of what I call self-regulation, which is the ability to go, whoa, my body is telling me stuff and I need to do something about it. And that can be, I'm upset and I need to stop, or it can be, you know what, those 40 lunges I did are really making my knee hurt. I need to tap out and sit down. And the very last piece for being a good player that I think is a really big responsibility that all of us have, and is also something that is often challenging, which is that we have to be able to ask for what we need. A good player has to be able to talk to the feeder and go, hey, can you hit me a little bit harder? Or, hey, can you back off and go a little bit lighter? Or, hey, I need you to not talk to me right now because when you try to give me verbal feedback, it really messes with my head. Or, hey, listen, my elbow is super messed up. Before we start this, can we make sure that you don't do any joint locks on that side of my body? Getting in the habit of voicing our needs to the person we're working with so that they can help take care of us is such a fundamental part of being a good partner. And it helps keep us safe, and it also helps keep the other person safe from being in the horrible situation of hurting us when they didn't know what was going on and could have otherwise prevented it. So my kind of big wrap up on all of this, and then we can take more questions, is in a training partnership, we've got a player and we've got a feeder. And the player's job within an exercise, the reason that they are there is to develop their motor and cognitive skills, to learn how to do a thing and to learn how to do it real good. And specifically to learn how to take intrinsic feedback and turn it into problem solving, or to use it within problem solving. So to figure out how to take the skill that they've learned and use it to actually accomplish something, mostly by paying attention to what happens to them in the environment that's happening. And the feeder's job, or the feeder's goal, is to build up all of those soft skills that are going to make them a really good tactician and a really good fighter, and point them towards building the right learning environment for the player. And if we can get those two things working in symbiosis, it makes classroom management really easy. It means everybody is actively learning in both parts of the drill. You don't just have the feeder being like, yeah, no, this is the part where I just kind of throw a cut and I switch my brain off. Everybody is getting everything they can out of their training time. They're not wasting half of it. And it's also a really good model, I think, for training without an instructor, for independent practice, because so much of what we do in HEMA is, you know, two people in a backyard fucking around with a text and trying to figure things out. And I think having some of that clarity around the roles and around how we can be, especially how we can be a good feeder, makes us good teachers for our peers, and means that we can do a whole bunch of really good training outside of a more formal environment. So that's kind of my stuff I wanted to throw at you guys today, and I am happy to chat more, take more questions, whatever.
All right. Anyone have any questions?
Okay, I'll go. I'll jump on one.
Yeah.
So outside of HEMA, have you observed any other groups that embody some of the things you're talking about? And could you share those? Contextualize my question. You know, I was in the Marines. I would never work with anybody else the way that we worked in the Marines. But also by comparison, you know, Taekwondo, Aikido, other dojos, they have things they do, but those don't always transfer as well. Is there anything you've observed outside of our box of HEMA that you think we would benefit from as a community that if they did it like, hey, do it like these guys, this one thing they do that embodies what you're saying?
Ooh, there's two that spring immediately to mind, only one of which is going to be useful to the general population. A lot of the training that I've done.
Oh no, I want to hear both now. Now I want to hear both.
Oh yeah, no, I will. First is the less useful one to everybody else, which is that as Charles mentioned in my intro, I've spent 5 years doing use of force training with my local police department. And a lot of the ways that we handle things in police training, especially the ways that you build scenarios and do stress testing and do things that should put people in an enormous amount of danger safely, has been fundamental to shifting how I do a lot of martial arts stuff, and has meant that I can push and challenge people a lot more aggressively than I otherwise would, because I understand how to build safety under stress, I guess. And that's something I write about a little bit in my book, and I talk about in workshops sometimes, but obviously go punch cops for a living isn't super accessible to most people. I
don't know, give things a couple weeks and that may change.
Well, it's a bit less of a structured environment than I was thinking of.
CKDF does not condone punching police officers.
Oh, right. No. Okay. Clear, neither do I.
The art that I've had some other contact with that's really good about a lot of this stuff is Judo. One of the things that I really like about Judo is that there's a really big emphasis often put on the role of the feeder in the way that they do things, that there is an ethic of care towards your partner built into stuff. And the entire kind of partner training philosophy is often very explicit about the fact that you have a job to do, and this is how you provide appropriate feedback, and this is how you make sure that you keep your partner safe, and kind of builds in a lot of the training principles that I've been talking about as just like part of the general culture of the art. And I know that a lot of the HEMA folk that I've talked to that have had backgrounds in Judo have brought a lot of those elements in over to their HEMA training with a lot of success. Jess Finley is one that comes to mind. She was a judoka before she started doing HEMA, and that idea of care and then partnership practices is something that she's absolutely brought into her training. So yeah, go do Judo. It'll also make you better at ringing.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Got one. So you mentioned ramping up scenarios and being able to stress test while working with the police forces. Do you bring elements of that to your students? And if so, how, and how do you gauge the appropriate level with which to do this?
All right. The short answer is heck yes, I do. The long answer in terms of how to really do that safely is honestly another 1.5 to 2 hour lecture. When I introduce this in a kind of packaged or simplified version to HEMA folks, I do it as a 2.5 or a 3 hour workshop. I think Charles actually attended mine at Sword Squatch. There's, in my book, there's like an entire chapter on it. I generally don't mix stress testing into drills. I do it as a separate piece of training. Drills are where we learn and we build basic skills and we start to figure out problem solving. And there can be a little bit of stress integrated into the problem solving aspect by making things go faster or making people do things tired or adding more elements or making people confused, sort of the ways that you make like games harder. But that's different from creating realistic scenarios and simulations of actual violence, which is what scenario testing is about. it's about creating situations that are as close an analog of real violence as we can safely create. And so things that will give our students really important information about how they function under real life conditions. And there's a whole bunch of psychological and physical safety stuff that goes into that I do not have time to cover right now.
Yeah.
But basically, it's something that I find super valuable and that I think should be treated as a discrete chunk of training that you make time for, but that you do separately from everything else, because it is dangerous and messy, and is also something that students should always opt into voluntarily rather than just having sprung on them in class. That's my somewhat diplomatic answer.
Yeah, I was part of the class. I wholeheartedly agree. That's the right call. Keep it separate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, drills are focusing on skill building and just problem solving. It's not the time or the place to introduce a high stress scenario just for giggles. It's interesting concept though. Like, I kind of want to play with it more, but obviously with the consent of the students.
Yep. And like, you know, with the right group, you can sneak it into drills if they know that this is a classroom or this is an environment where that is something that happens. Mm-hmm. They've opted into the environment. And you can add a little bit of stress and a little bit of pressure to stuff. But any time that you're dealing with stuff that could potentially have, basically more adrenaline equals more danger and more chaos. And one of the explicit goals of stress testing or scenario building, the way that I do it, is to get people adrenalized and to get them to operate under a high level of adrenaline, because that changes the game. And as soon as you are adrenalizing people, everything gets much more dangerous and much more unpredictable. So you better be very prepared for what that's going to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Completely different focus. I mentioned, or I'm like halfway through your book. I'm on like page 100 something at this point, and it's like one of the first books that I've seriously annotated since high school. Like, I have tabbies and everything. This thing is great.
Oh my God, that makes me so happy.
Yeah, this thing is insanely good. That being said, you do mention various exercises and movement skill building that you do to develop proprioception with your students, with a heavy focus in gymnastics.
Sorry, your audio is cutting out. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was really loud before, so I moved my mic away.
No, loud was better.
Yeah, loud is good.
Okay. So it was, my question surrounds your focus on proprioception building and movement fluency, I guess, with newer members, especially those who are coming to HEMA or any physical activity with zero experience, not much body knowledge. You mentioned a heavy focus on gymnastics. What areas or skills do you focus on the most at the beginning to build that body fluency quickly? Well.
So my absolute favorite tool for throwing at people is animal crawl. Is move your body in ways that you've never moved your body before. And that's something that you can build on in terms of having a skill building component to it as well. But basically the biggest thing that you want to do to people initially to develop proprioception is you want to confuse them. And specifically, you want to put them in situations that challenge their ability to map where their body is in space. So any kind of rolling or tumbling or inverted work is super awesome for that. I love teaching people shoulder rolls because first of all, they're a really useful safety tool. And second of all, your body is doing this.
Yeah.
Your proprioceptive abilities have to start kind of kicking into high gear because you are upside down. And when you're upside down, your body kind of freaks out and goes, oh my God, where are my arms? Where are my feet? What is going on? And it starts getting better at mapping that stuff and mapping your internal sense of movement. Handstands or headstands can be good for that as well, but obviously that's, there's a bit of a skill progression there that you need to work on. But I spend a lot of time rolling and crawling and doing weird animal movements and just getting people to move in ways that they have never moved their body before, so that they don't have a previous frame of reference that they can kind of fall back on. They have to figure out how to do it from nothing.
Okay.
And that really, really helps. The other tool that we've started using more recently, especially as a warm-up tool, that's actually super great for a little bit of hand-eye coordination stuff, is playing with bouncy balls.
Interesting. Like the super bouncy balls?
Not even. Actually, hang on one sec. I've got a lacrosse ball here. I can show you. Everybody can see my stupid pajama pants. So there's a bouncy ball. Usually when we bounce the ball and catch it, our brain kind of cheats in terms of mapping the movement of the ball. Because what happens is the ball comes up, it hits our palm, and then we close our fingers around it. So all we have to do to catch it correctly is kind of stick our hand somewhere above it, and then we know that when it hits us, we can just catch. It's a little shortcut, and it makes us better at catching stuff. Playing with making students catch things with their fingertips instead, all of a sudden, your brain has to coordinate these 5 separate entities and put them in the right place to catch a thing, especially if you catch from the side rather than from below or from above. And that's a thing that is very difficult. And that starts to help with hand-eye coordination stuff. And you can get people bouncing balls from hand to hand. You can get them bouncing them off the wall and catching them. You can get them with a ball in each hand and then bounce them to the opposite one. That's always super fun. And I love using that as a warm-up as well, because it has very high failure rate. People miss a lot. And when you miss, you have to go chase your ball. And if you do that for about 15 minutes, you get people breathing pretty hard. And having done like a whole bunch of sprinting and diving the floor and jumping past each other just to hang on to their stupid bouncy balls. And you've done a fairly vigorous warm-up without anybody really noticing.
And that's your play model right there, right? Because it's a fun, lighthearted way to get the brain and the body going.
Exactly. So yeah, bouncy balls, crawling, and rolling. That'll get you real far.
Awesome. I was trying to mess with like bringing elements of ballet or dancing into it, like ballet, modern type stuff. Like the ballet is hard. So like there's this whole other set of body fluency that you have to have. And I don't think it translates well to longsword. I think it translates better to like a rapier focus because you use similar muscles. I think modern translates pretty well to longsword though, because you're moving your body in all of these weird ways with all these snap decisions and small tweaks. So I'm like diving back through all of my dancing notebooks and trying to find fun, weird things to throw at people.
I absolutely love that. Yes, there should. One of my big things that I like to rant about is that there should be more dance in martial arts as a thing that we use to get better at this stuff, because it's such a big part of the context that was happening historically, and it's such a fantastic teacher for physical literacy and proprioception, and it's
really
fun.
Is. Yeah, plus the flexibility and the strengthening that comes along with it, anyways. Like.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, I think you're definitely heading in the right direction with that. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Cool. Looks like Ken has raised his hand.
Yeah, so my question was kind of similar to Marlene. Within HEMA, we have kind of an interesting demographic when we have a lot of individuals that come to it without a traditional background in martial arts or martial sport. How do you cultivate a martial mindset or discipline in new students?
How do you define a martial mindset and discipline?
A shut up and train mentality is probably how I would best describe it.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what that means?
I find that there's a time to train and a time to socialize, and I find that that often gets blurred in a lot of clubs. How do you recommend going about finding a good balance between building that community and approaching martial arts with a kind of a certain level of respect?
I'm going to say right off the bat that I'm maybe not the best person to ask about this, in that my idea of what constitutes respect or a serious approach towards martial arts doesn't often overlap with traditional ideals. I like a classroom that is silly and somewhere where people laugh and somewhere where people have fun. And that doesn't mean that they're socializing or being distracted from the learning. But it does mean that they're motivated by a sense of play, which isn't always a priority in kind of serious martial arts land. That being said, I think it does speak to a useful way of getting people to really focus on their training, which is that the training itself should be fun. It should be pleasurable. It should be something that they enjoy and they find rewarding. That doesn't mean that it should be easy, or that it shouldn't challenge them, that it shouldn't frustrate them sometimes. But there has to be an intrinsic satisfaction to what you're doing, or you're gonna socialize, or you're gonna fuck around. When I see my students chit-chatting or losing focus or blurring that line between, oh, this is just hangouts and social time and this is actually martial arts where we focus on martial arts, I take that as a cue that they are not engaging emotionally with the training that we're doing. And so my goal then becomes to get them to care about it, to get them engaged more. And that can be throwing them a new challenge. That can be giving them a clearer understanding of the point of what we're doing. That can be giving them new things to get excited about or new things to appreciate, throwing a new weapon at them, or showing them what the thing we're working on is going to kind of take them towards. But just like I focus on intrinsic feedback versus extrinsic feedback, I feel like cultivating internal joy and interest and engagement and like a hunger for training is a lot easier than, or a lot more effective than building external structures that just kind of people to do the thing. So fun and joy are my biggest tools for getting people to focus and to work real hard.
Cool. Thank you for the feedback.
You're welcome.
I've got a question. So, so far we've been talking about this from kind of the perspective of instructors, but, say I'm a relatively new student and I have a lot of solo time for, say, the next few weeks or months.
For instance, as a complete
just an example. I've got a plethora of solo time. What kinds of questions should I be asking myself? So let's break it into two different questions. Mm-hmm. The first one is a new student, and another one is someone who's been doing this for about a year, 2 years, 3 years, like enough for them to, think they know things,
right.
and have things to contribute. So those are two categories. But the question I have is, during this alone time, what are some questions they should be asking themselves about how to be a better partner? Just like introspective questions, or we know that there are skills that they should be working on in an abstract sense, but are there questions or are there things that they should be looking internally to try to improve their partnering skills, or at least their mindset?
That's a great question. I think the place that I would start is thinking about yourself in a partnered situation, in a drill or when you train, and thinking about what your goals and your intentions are when you're in that feeder role. What is, like, be really honest with yourself. Where are you currently when you're feeding? Are you bored? Are you impatient? Are you thinking about what you're going to do next, or are you thinking about your partner? Build kind of as accurate a picture as you can, and as honest a picture as you can, of where you're currently at as a partner, and specifically where your interest and where your psychological focus. And then that'll give you a whole bunch of places where you can go, oh, hey, I'm doing that real good. Let's keep doing that. Give yourself some nice positive extrinsic feedback. Or places where you go, oh man, you know, I remember I was thinking about this drill that I was doing the other day, or when I think about myself in the environment where, you know, maybe we're practicing a ring throw and I'm being thrown, and all I'm thinking about is how not to land on my head. Oh, that's rough. How do I fix that? What can I shift about who I'm thinking about, or what I care about the most when I'm doing a drill? And sometimes, especially like if you're really new, you've never done any wrestling before, and you're getting thrown, then keeping yourself from landing on your head might be completely appropriate. But building an awareness of where you're at. The other one I think that would be useful to play with, and this edges into skill building a little bit, is how much I think I know about what's going on with my partner when we train. You know, can I think of times when I've fought somebody where I noticed their emotional state? And if you're new to martial arts, if that's not a framework that you have yet, that can become, how good am I at noticing people's emotions in social interactions? How aware am I of how people are feeling when I talk to them? Because that's a useful kind of starting framework for this. So how do I know people? How do I get some sense of their interiority? How good am I at, you can call it empathizing, or you can call it some kind of external analysis of emotion, but like, do I even think about that?
Yeah.
You know? Where am I in my own head, or am I actually really thinking about my partner when I work with them? And to what extent and in what ways am I doing that?
Yeah. It's deep. Side tangent, hopefully it won't take too long, but I have a hunch that this is extremely valuable for modern self-defense applications, mainly because you're reading emotional states that border violence. That's something that we don't have to think about, or at least theoretically, we don't have to think about as historical practitioners. But for a self-defense application, it seems like a very salient point.
Yeah, and actually the really big one that I would even like pinpoint and narrow it down to, if I had to, is how well can you tell that somebody's getting adrenalized? Because adrenalization is such a component of violence. You know, it's really hard to fight if that amping up hasn't happened. And there are emotional and there are physiological signs of adrenaline that we see in people. Can you spot them? Can you read them? Can you tell that somebody is stressed and upset? Because often that feeds into the same thing. And yeah, that's a thing that I teach in self-defense programming, and it's something that's absolutely valuable. is a neat thing to think about, because we do kind of work in these like violence adjacent contexts where some of that stuff might be showing up as an undesirable thing, and we need to be able to watch for it and be able to start managing it. Yeah. That's actually another really, really good thing for introspection that I think everybody can do, is get a handle on their own relationship to adrenaline. Do I know how I respond to stress? What happens to me when I'm scared? What happens to me when I'm freaked out? What happens to me when I feel unsafe? Because those are all things that you're probably going to bring into a training partnership at some point. You know, shit always eventually goes sideways. Mistakes get made, buttons get pushed. Sometimes you just have a bad day, or you didn't have enough to eat, and all of a sudden it's way easier to trigger you than it otherwise would be. So building an understanding of, who am I when I get adrenalized? How do I get adrenalized? Do I even know what adrenaline does to me? Do I know what adrenaline is? Is a really good kind of personal rabbit hole that I would encourage everybody to go down. Possibly with a buddy that you can talk it out with, and or a hot bath to take after.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions? I don't want to keep Kaja here forever though, so get your questions in while you have them.
Yeah, I got one last one. Simple question. Your thoughts on using cameras for providing feedback, you know, recording the person, then having them watch it later?
I think they are extremely useful for helping people build a sense of body mechanics and proprioception. I use a lot of it on video feedback when we're at that like laying down motor pattern stage of skill building, and especially with beginners who don't really have a good sense of where their bodies are in space. Sometimes it's as easy as showing them a video or a photo of themselves doing a skill and being like, did you know that your arm was doing that thing? And it's a really useful tool for helping people start to map what their bodies do when they're moving a sword around, or when they're wrestling, or whatever. It's really, really valuable for that.
Definitely sounds like emotional intelligence is critical here, though. You know, in that moment of showing the video. So, do you like to do it on the spot? Like I've recommended the best, like, you know, record yourself, but to go home and watch it. Like me showing you yourself on a cell phone sometimes has not gone well. You know, like, hey, I recorded you, watched it. That seems to have been a little too confrontational. Like, just, you know, watch yourself at home.
Yeah, I use it the most in one-on-one teaching. And I'll always make sure that the student knows that it's going to happen beforehand. I never spring it on somebody as a surprise. And I'll ask first. Consent is nice. Usually I'll explain to them the point of it as well. Because it's really easy. It's like we were talking earlier about people watching increasing stress. Having a camera pointed at you can definitely be a stressful thing. So I'll let people know, you know, hey, what I want to do is I want to get some video of what you're doing. The point here isn't to point out mistakes or give you feedback on your form or whatever. It's to help you build an accurate picture of what your body is doing. So I don't need to see you watch this. I don't have to like talk you through it or anything like that, but you should see this. You should know what your body looks like when you do stuff. And what I have done with some people who are like, get super stressed out by video is I go, okay, at some point during this class, I'm going to video you doing this thing. I will try to do it when you're not paying attention, and I will not tell you in the moment when I'm filming, so that you don't get stressed and you don't freeze up. So you can kind of get blanket consent for like, at some point in this class, you will be videotaped. And that can work really well. But yeah, that's where I use it the most often. It can also be valuable for like debriefing after sparring or after tournaments. And then usually I kind of use it in the same way, not as a like, let's break this down and microanalyze every step sort of thing. but as a reality check to confirm that a person's understanding of what happened actually is what happened, and helping them build that strong relationship between the intrinsic feedback they got in the fight and what was actually happening around them. And that can be really, really useful sometimes, where you can be like, hey, did you feel that when it landed? Did you notice that your body did this thing in response to that attack? And again, you're helping build those feedback processing skills more than anything else. So that's how I use it.
John's giving a thumbs up.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Well, we are way past time. I encourage everyone to stick around, hang around and chat if you'd like, but can use this chance to thank Kaja for her time and do a quick plug for her book, which is Fear is the Mind Killer. Oh, she has it right there. Perfect.
I have it right here.
I'm holding up my copies. But yeah, you can find it on Amazon, or is there some other place you'd prefer them to purchase?
You can get it via Amazon. You can get it through Barnes & Noble. It is set up so that if you were to go to your friendly local bookstore and or email them pleasantly from a distance, they should be able to order it in. It is very widely available at this point. I have folks that have ordered it from like local independent booksellers. I know people that have gone to online stores. So pretty much anywhere you get from is fantastic. As far as I'm concerned, just get your hands on it.
All right. Well, her book is Fear is the Mind Killer, and you can find it in many, many places. Thank you very much, Kaja, for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Charles. This was really great.
All right. Well, afterwards, feel free to stick around, chat, and oh, smooth jazz narration voice. Yeah. Yeah, stick around and chat. You know, say hi to people. This is also partially a social event. But yeah, you guys can all like unmute. All right. Thank you, Kaja.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kaja.